Let's dive right into today's explainer. We're unpacking a really deep dive from our source material into the age of the Earth. We'll be examining exactly how time itself is measured, how those measurements are interpreted by scientists, and ultimately why this topic is so fiercely debated. Today, we're deconstructing the timelines and looking closely at the core assumptions that build them.
The source gives us a very clear roadmap to understand this debate. We're going to cover the narrative of time, the history of deep time, the assumptions of radiometric dating, 4 challenges to deep time, and finally, design, decay, and genesis.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the narrative of time and defining origins.
To start, the presentation establishes a foundational idea. The age of the Earth isn't just a scientific question, it's actually a massive worldview question. Why? Because whoever defines time essentially controls the entire narrative of origins. Now, when we talk about the age of our planet, you have to remember we aren't measuring it directly. It's not like you can just put the Earth on a giant scale to check its weight, or gravitate measure to check its age, right? Instead, we're building a complex framework of assumptions to interpret the data we find around us today.
And get this, the source highlights a study on human mitochondrial DNA that illustrates this perfectly. Traditionally, scientists used a mutation rate based on the assumption that humans and chimps diverged about 5 million years ago. That math leads to a mitochondrial Eve living roughly 200,000 years ago. But when researchers took that exact same data and applied faster, modern, actually observed mutation rates, the timeline for mitochondrial Eve shrank drastically. We're talking down to a mere 6,000 years. The general scientific community's response was basically, well, no one thinks that's the case. But it hits the nail on the head regarding the source's main point. Your starting assumptions literally dictate your mathematical outcomes.
So the source argues that the physical data itself, the rocks, the fossils, the DNA, hasn't changed at all. What changes are those starting assumptions. You have a very clear distinction between 2 main frameworks here. On one side, the macroevolutionary model absolutely requires deep time and uniformitarianism. That's the idea that geologic processes have always been slow, steady, and gradual. On the flip side, the biblical creation model suggests a much shorter history, one heavily shaped by catastrophism, meaning sudden, massive global events.
Moving on to Section 2, the history of deep time and how these paradigms shifted.
Let's trace how this built up historically, because our accepted timelines shifted wildly over just a few short centuries. Back in the 1600s, Archbishop Ussher calculated the Earth's creation at exactly 4004 BC using biblical genealogies. But then, by the late 1700s, James Hutton proposed uniformitarianism, basically taking catastrophe right out of the equation. Following that, you had Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin. And the source notes something really important here. Darwin absolutely required vast amounts of time for macroevolution to work. Without deep time, his whole theory just collapses. Later on, early 1900s, Ernest Rutherford introduced radiometric decay, which pushed the clock back even further. Fast forward to today, and the Earth's age is inferred to be roughly 4.5 billion years. Essentially, the clock was expanded to fit a brand new scientific framework.
That brings us to Section 3, assumptions of radiometric dating.
Okay, to understand how modern science calculates these billions of years, we have to dust off our high school physics for just a second. Scientists estimate a rock's age based on a concept called the half-life. You start with an unstable parent isotope, which slowly decays over a very predictable amount of time into a stable daughter element. By measuring the ratio of parent to daughter elements found in a rock today, scientists are essentially using this radioactive decay as a ticking clock to calculate the rock's age.
But here is the absolute kicker, and it's a huge takeaway from this explainer. The presentation points out that for this math to actually work, 3 massive conditions must be entirely 100% true. First, the decay rates must have always been constant throughout history. Second, you have to know exactly what the initial starting ratios were at the exact moment the rock formed. And third, the rock must have been a perfectly isolated closed system for its entire history, meaning no chemicals ever seeped in and nothing ever washed away. If even one of those assumptions is uncertain, your resulting date is an interpretation. It's not an absolute observed fact.
To really highlight this, the source pulls a fascinating quote from a 1981 scientific critique on carbon-14 dating. It reads, "The troubles of the radiocarbon dating method are undeniably deep and serious. Fully half of the dates are rejected. The accepted dates are actually selected dates." That's pretty wild, right? It reveals that calibration and unprovable assumptions, like guessing what the Earth's atmosphere was like thousands of years ago, play a massive role in determining these dates. It's an evaluation process. It's not just a simple plug-and-play calculation.
Let's look at Section 4, 4 challenges to deep time.
The speaker lays out 4 very specific physical anomalies to argue that the Earth's history might actually be far shorter than we're told. First up, radiometric inconsistencies. A great example? 6 rock samples were taken from the exact same lava flow at the Uinkaret Plateau. When tested, they returned dates ranging wildly from 10,000 years old all the way up to 17 million years old. Second, you have living fossils. These are organisms like the coelacanth fish or the Wollemi pine that were assumed extinct for hundreds of millions of years based on the fossil record. But recently, they were found alive and well, showing virtually zero evolutionary change. Third, there are massive gaps in the rock record. Take the Great Unconformity at the Grand Canyon. Over 1 billion years of geological time is just completely missing between 2 touching layers of rock. And fourth, impossible preservation. We're talking about finding stretchy, soft tissue, proteins, and cellular features inside T-Rex bones that are supposed to be 65 million years old. Under any normal biological expectation, that organic material should have completely decayed eons ago.
The presentation doubles down on this unreliability with a super practical test. There are volcanic rocks out there with documented historical ages, meaning actual human beings witnessed the eruption, wrote down the date, and watched the lava cool. But when those exact same rocks are put through radiometric lab testing today, they often yield incredibly old dates, sometimes in the millions of years. The source argues that when actual historical observation directly contradicts the radiometric math, we really need to question the assumptions behind the math.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Design, Decay, and Genesis.
Having deconstructed those mainstream dating methods, the source pivots to an alternative synthesis. It notes that the creation account in Genesis isn't meant to be read just as poetry. The source views it as a highly structured historical account. It points directly to the ancient Hebrew words tohu and bohu, which mean without form and void. The narrative lays out a very methodical process. God first forms the environments out of that void, so the sky, the water, the land, and then he subsequently fills those environments with life, the birds, the fish, and the animals.
And this brings up a really fascinating point about how we as humans experience time. Think about it. We get our year from the sun, our month from the moon, and our day from the Earth's rotation. But the 7-day week? It has absolutely no astronomical basis. None. According to the presentation, time is given meaning through rhythm. So the fact that a 7-day week exists universally, completely disconnected from the stars or the planets, points straight back to this original creation design. It establishes a rhythm built toward a Sabbath, a time dedicated entirely to relationship and connection.
So if it was designed so perfectly, why do we see so much breakdown in the world today? Well, the source ties the science of entropy directly to theology. It argues that the consistent universal decay we observe everywhere, like in our genetics, the fading of the Earth's magnetic field, and yes, even in radiometric isotopes, is the physical manifestation of the biblical fall. The Apostle Paul used 2 specific Greek words, makatoietes, meaning purposelessness, and thora, meaning decay. The presentation argues that this universal tendency for things to break down is a result of sin. It's not a mechanism driving macroevolutionary progress. In this worldview, science is simply measuring the decay, while Scripture explains why it's happening in the first place.
But the source makes sure to emphasize that this narrative doesn't just end in ruin and decay. This theological framework actually provides an ultimate hope. Amidst all this breakdown, the biblical text offers what it calls a confident expectation. The Greek word for that is elpis. It's the expectation of a fully restored creation, one that is finally freed from its bondage to decay and death.
As we wrap up this explainer, the source leaves us with one final, very provocative thought. If the Earth around us shows undeniable signs of brilliant, complex design, but is simultaneously locked into continuous, measurable downward decay, well, what does that suggest about the origin of the universe as a whole? It points us outward from our own planet, setting the stage to really question the origin of all space, energy, and matter. It's a massive question for sure, and one that challenges every single one of us to look closely at the assumptions we bring to the table when we look at the evidence.